check video into that computer from this? Okay, thanks. I don't have a way to I can't log into this computer, so I'm assuming that part still works. It's usually the video stuff that I'm more concerned about than the audio.
Me too.
Yeah, if you're able to do that.
We tested it this morning just to make sure everything was fine. I mean,
you can test it. We can
this
test
is
it
fine.
with music.
I didn't know if you wanted to like switch out for the RCA setup again.
So I didn't have that audio extractor put in down here. I don't know if I changed my mind on it just for these rooms down here or if I just didn't get to it.
Okay.
Because we ran out of time.
Yeah.
But we can certainly just check it via like a head, although I don't have a 3.5 phone. Music is sufficient for me. If it works there, then it's maybe to figure out how to use my computer.
Right.
I've been adjusting the trim on mine. The audio feed into the video streaming we're doing is really low.
Right. Okay. Yep.
You still want me to test my mic? Yeah. Audio works if somebody doesn't have audio off their computer. Well, it's actually, I think it was audio off the microphone that we were using. That's what issue. Too low or what? See, it wasn't during the second half of last talk. It didn't fix. Sure how to capture the mic. Yeah, because we're just not sure. It's the same.
Check 1 2 mic check. Check 1 2 microphone. Check 1 2. Ooh, it's so loud. 1 2. 1 2 check 1 2. Microphone check 1 2 2 2. 2 2 check 1 2 2. Check 1 2. Better than it was. Because the handheld will not be on unless they turn it on, but we'll let them know. 1 2 check 1 2. Microphone test check. Welcome to your Louisville Downtown Marriott. Yeah. I believe so. 1 2 check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. 2 2 check 1 2. Microphone check 1 2. EQing. EQing right now. Microphone test check. Welcome to your Louisville Downtown Marriott, where we have suites and amenities that you can purchase, I'm sure, for a great price. I don't know. I've never been to a suite in the Marriott before myself, but I work here. Isn't that great? Microphone test check 1 2 2 2. Okay. Did you get that in there?
Yep.
Cool.
Thank you.
each person of these people, just have them like here and just do the down arrow.
That's it. You just right and left.
Oh, right, left, okay.
Yep, down will start like the video for Carrie on her slides, but otherwise right and left to go forward and back.
Okay, cool.
That's it.
All right.
Okay. All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Harold Ogden, and I'm here this morning with Carrie Roberts and Kirk Sayer. We're going to present on VBA stomping, advanced malware document techniques. I'm a systems engineer turned blue team a couple of years ago. I work at Walmart doing security operations and continuous monitoring. And I'm on the dynamic defense engineering team, blue team at Walmart. Carrie Roberts is a developer turned red team. And she's a senior red team engineer at Walmart. She's got her master's in information security from SANS Technology Institute. And then Kirk Sayer is academic turned, or security tool researcher turned blue team. He's also on the dynamic defense engineering team, the blue team with me here at Walmart. He's got his PhD computer science at University of Tennessee. And before we jump into the more complicated process of VBA stomping, we're going to start off with just some real VBA crafting fundamentals for crafting malicious documents that you may be using as part of an engagement. And just to educate maybe if you're on the defense side on some of the things that we're seeing real malicious documents do today that we've seen be very effective. So I know this is something everyone's probably very familiar with at this point, but the old Office 97 format is a proprietary compound OLE file. It's not compressed, but some of the parts of it are. And it's usually, as we'll look at in a minute here, named like .doc or .xls. We've all seen that a million times by now. And then in 2007, the new OpenXML format came out. The whole file is compressed. It's all zipped, and you can unzip it with 7-zip. It's an openish standard. It's really easy to unzip it and look at the individual parts inside of it. So one of the things that we see taken advantage of, and it also will work to your advantage, is that extensions can lie. So just because something's named .xls doesn't mean it's the old 97 format. So that's one of the things that you can take advantage of. So the XLS will open both the XLS and XLSM format. So you can have an XLS file that'll run macros on the new OpenOffice format. But if you have an XLS file, this is a really important point, you cannot have a macro-enabled document that's XLS extension. Excel and then Word for DocX, they just refuse to run macros out of those extensions. So you don't ever want to name your files that way. So if you're going to have to pick a extension, XLS is a great extension to pick, and you can rename your XLSM file after you've done whatever you want to the document, and it will run. That can confuse defenders and confuse signatures, because if they are looking at an XLS, they expect it not to be compressed, and they may be running signatures against the file in its raw form, when really they need to be decompressing it first, unzipping it, and looking at the subparts of the file. The XLSM format, while it can contain macros, I would avoid, because no one ever names a file that unless it's going to contain macros. So it's like a huge red flag immediately for defenders and for signatures. So object linking and embedding, if you're not familiar with it, it's a proprietary format Microsoft developed. Like I said earlier, 97 format. The whole thing is in one big OLE file, but in the Office 97, in Office 2007 and Plus in the Open Office format, VBA that you write is going to be stored in a OLE compound file that's clearly separate from the other parts of the document, and it's going to be saved as VBA project.bin inside that zip file. Okay, so one of the first things you can do to make sure that you're not getting caught by detective mechanisms is just like spend a little bit of time building your own VBA payload. And if you go use any of the off-the-shelf frameworks, it's going to be kind of a hit or miss for you, usually about 15, 20 plus detections across the 60 antivirus that are like in VirusTotal today. And so one of the things that you can do is just start building these yourselves. And one of the things you're going to want to do, you can do other things here. This is not a comprehensive list of things you can do in a malicious document, but you're going to want to create a process, whether it's create like a MSHTA to go download your payload. If you want to run PowerShell, you want to run some sort of an additional process out of your document. You can do that with shell. You can create a wscript.shell object and run it. You can use WMI to do a process create. So to start with, like here's about the simplest payload that you can put into a malicious document. This will go get PowerShell from that remote location, and then it'll eval it, it'll run it, and so you can stage your payload somewhere else. But the problem with this is that you're signature fodder, right? Like you have things in here that are really easy to signature on, and a lot of antivirus companies have done this because this is commonly used by malware today. I took this payload from a malicious document that was being used to deliver legitimate malware. So it's being looked for. So we're going to go through a couple of steps here to make this get targeted a little bit less and be more evasive. So we're going to obfuscate first. Then we're going to do some generalization of like variable names and make sure that those things aren't being looked at as carefully. Then we'll do some anti-analysis at the end to make sure that like things like sandboxes are a little bit less effective against us. So the first thing we can do is ditch shell. And one of the things you go straight to is WMI. WMI, when you see it just in the clear, is a great indication of a malicious document. So you go from shell, which is ambiguous, it could be a business process, to WMI, which is probably like Empire, because Empire uses that by default. So at first, it seems like switching to WMI could be a bad idea, because our initial payload is being hit by 21 antivirus vendors. We switched to WMI using the default Empire WMI process create, and we go up to 27 detections. So we took a step back. Right now, almost half of the antivirus vendors are going to catch us. But then, if we take the Empire payload and we minimize it, we get rid of some of the optional things there, like that set the window, the shell window to 0, which makes the PowerShell won't blip at the bottom of the taskbar for like a half a second. We lose a little bit there, but now we're back down to down to 23 detections, which is still, again, a step back from where we were. However, these are the things that are being targeted by signatures that are out there today. Like the antivirus companies are looking for these to say these are bad documents. This is bad VBA. These are things that we want to block coming into an environment. So WMI is bad, but the get object we're using to create that WMI is ambiguous. It's not necessarily bad by itself. It's just those like win, MGMTS, and other common strings. So if all we do is reverse those strings, we don't spend a whole lot of time here, and we are now down to 7 detections. So that's like the most simple of obfuscation. We see malicious documents and malicious VBA do this, but people have written signatures for reverse strings. People look for backwards HTTP and the slashes and things like that because they know reversing these things happens. So it's not going to be a very future-proofed obfuscation method for you, but that's all it took. to go down to 7, was we just flipped everything backwards. So now you can't see those in their plain form. If you're going to build a larger payload, you don't want to keep calling string reverse over and over. So we will often stub that out to a function, and then you'll just call whatever function you move that to over and over so that string reverse won't show up like 50 times in your document. So you can't always avoid using a method, but if you have to use a method, only use it once, stub it out like we looked at before. Obfuscate all the strings in the data that you can so that it'll make your payload hard to signature, and use variable and function names that are hard to signature as well. So we've been talking about using Excel in this so far, and there's things that are really common in Excel, and that's numbers and like calendar apps people have written in Excel macros. So the first thing we're going to do is take our payload and we're going to rot, like in this case, rot 19 all of it, and just store it as one big array of numbers. We're not going to store it in like an array with any kind of delimiter because those get looked for. Those are really suspicious in macros, so it's going to be one big block of numbers, and now our payload looks like this. So then we're going to name all of our functions that we use to decode this after months of the year and days of the week. And if you try to write a signature looking for days of the week and months of the year in Excel, then you're going to get a lot of false positives. So this is something that we can do to hopefully not get detected. And then our main function there goes and does to do all the decoding. So we'll call June anytime we want to decode a string. And that's our main function there. And now you'll notice that when you do a WMI process create, normally the arguments are going to be like 0, 0, null. But VBA is really nice, and they will take uninitialized variables and return them as nulls or zeros for you. So you don't have to leave that pattern intact for signatures. So you can just say, you know, I've never used these variables. I'm going to put in these random words here, and these are going to return nulls and zeros for me. And these here are our WinMGMTS and our Win32 process. So these are no longer plain strings that signatures can key off of. So now we're back down to 7, where we were with the string reverse. However, now we have the support for an arbitrarily large payload. We can bring anything we want with us and make it as large as we want, and it's going to look the same as this because it's all encoded in this big encoded payload. But we can take it a little further by implementing some anti-sandbox techniques. So the first one we're going to use has been documented many times, and we took a lot of inspiration from like PA Fish macro, and there's in Ebola, there's been some good talks about keying so far here at DerbyCon. And this is really effective against the VMs that are not domain joined, right? So we just see if the computer name's the same as the user domain. And if it is, then just don't run. And we just use an English dictionary to populate the variable name so that it's not ever going to be the same. And then we do an anti-fake net technique, and we saw this used by like the WannaCry malware, where you just go try to access something that doesn't exist. So in this case, location.microsoft.com is a non-existent domain. So if we're inside of a VM and they're fake netting us, it will respond, and we know we're in a VM with fake net, and we don't do anything. Now, the interesting thing here that we didn't initially expect is that our detection rate went down when we implemented these things. So we went down to 6 upon initial implementation. Then, whenever we obfuscated, we went down to 3. Which indicates that there's some emulation going on inside these AV engines. So by implementing anti-fake net and anti-virtual machine analysis, the analysis of some of our VBA macros was failing, or it was not detecting it as malicious. So now we're down to 3 detections, where we started at like 21 to 26, and now we're at a pretty good spot where we're evading the majority of antivirus, but we can take it further. And so we're going to look at how they're analyzing these VBA macros. So the security products are looking at the compressed VBA source code to analyze all of these things we've written so far. But what if we didn't need the source? What if we didn't need that information that all of the analysis tools are looking at? So the next thing we're going to do is looking at stomping the VBA, but the macros will still run.
Hello, Carrie Roberts here, and I'm going to talk about VBA stomping. So before we get into VBA stomping, let's talk a little bit about how the macros are stored. And Harold mentioned they're stored in a file called vbaproject.bin, at least by default. That can be changed, but they're stored or can be stored in 3 different ways. First is the source code, like what the developer actually types in. So a lot of what you just saw, that it's stored in that format, but it's compressed, so it looks a little bit jumbled, but a compressed source code. Next is as a compiled pseudocode, kind of like assembly language. It's called P code. And that's actually what executes most of the time in a document. And the third is exe codes, but I'm not talking about that here, but Dr. Bonchev has a write-up on it on his GitHub there, if you want to read more about this. So on your left, you see the Visual Basic Editor, which you use to develop your macros from Word. So you see a subroutine there, auto open, with a message box ABC. The way that's stored in the Word document in the VBA project.bin file is shown in blue down there. You see the hex on the left, and on the right you see any readable string. So you see sub, auto open, message box, ABC, and it's a little jumbled because it's actually compressed, and you know, it kind of seems like it's not compressed that well because it's like bigger. But they call that compressed VBA. So on the right is the P code. So up in the black, it looks a little readable there, but that's just as a favor to us. We can kind of see the function definitions. We can see a string of ABC declared and an argument call, but when you look at that actually in the binary file, it looks like that down below, a bunch of hex, which if you look at the readable strings, the only thing you can really decipher easily from that P code is the string ABC. So those are 2 ways it's stored in the VBA project.bin file. I pushed the wrong arrow. Okay, so we're going to play a little bit with the compressed VBA source. So we're going to go into the VBA project.bin file, and we're going to change the string ABC in the compressed source code to XYZ and save it and see what happens. Okay, so here we have our ABC document. It's got that simple message box pop up. And we're gonna open this with 7-zip. So we go to 7-zip, open archive. The nice thing about 7-zip is it can open up a zip file and let you look inside and even edit something. And when you exit, it'll zip it all back up for you. So you don't have to like unzip it all and then rezip it all manually. So here we have the .docm file opened, and we see it's just a compilation of a bunch of other files and directories. So we have a doc properties directory, a Word directory. Inside the Word directory, you'll find the VBA project.bin. And that's the thing we want to edit. So we right-click on this, and we're going to say open outside, which means open it with our third-party program for opening bin files. And I have my system set to open a bin file with the HXD hex editor that I have installed. So when I click open outside, it's going to open up right up in the hex editor. And we're going to search for the string ABC because that's what we want to play with. So we search for that. And the first place we find it, we can recognize the P code here. We see the string ABC, but we don't understand much else there. And down below, we see it in the second spot. And we see that that's the compressed VBA source. So we kind of can read sub auto open message box ABC. So that's where we want to play with. So we're going to change that ABC string to XYZ and see how Word behaves. So we save that. We exit out of here. And again, 7-zip is nice because it says you change this file. Do you want to zip that back up and make it part of the original docm file? And you say okay, and then it just does that for you. You could do this with a regular zip tool, but it's more steps. So that 7-zip's nice in that way. Okay, so now we have the ABC docm file where we've tinkered with the VBA source, but we haven't touched the P code. So before we enable content, we're going to go over to the Developer tab and bring up the Visual Basic Editor. And so in the Visual Basic Editor, it looks like we have a macro that when we enable it, it's going to pop up a message box that says XYZ. And so we're okay with that, so we go ahead and we enable content. But to our surprise, it doesn't say XYZ like it said it was going to say. It says ABC. So clearly, it was the P code that got executed there and not the, this thing's talking in the background. Is this muted? It's distract. I think I got it. I got it muted. I can quietly hear myself talking in the video behind. So now we go back into the VBA editor, and we see that last time we looked, before we enabled macros, it used to say XYZ. When we enable macros, it actually prints out ABC, and then we go back into the Visual Basic editor, and it's been updated, and now it says ABC, so we start to think that we're losing our mind. So what you see isn't necessarily what you get. So we saw that before we enabled the macros, if we went to the Visual Basic editor, what was displayed there was the decompressed source code, that thing that we had tinkered with. But when you enable macros, what actually executed was the P code that we hadn't played with, and then when you visit the VBA editor, you no longer see the decompressed source code that was tinkered with, you see the decompiled P code. So what actually gets executed, if the P code is compatible, it's the P code that will run. And so in this example, we had compatible P code, so the P code ran, not our tinkered VBA source. But if the P code's incompatible, Word will take that source code, recompile it, and run that P code, and those two things will match. So that brings us to VBA stomping, which is instead of just tinkering with the VBA source, let's just completely wipe it out. It's not needed if the P code's compatible. So on the left, you see that we're just taking our hex editor, we're highlighting the VBA source, and we're telling it overwrite it with 0. So down at the very bottom, you see what used to be the VBA source is now all zeroed out, and we save that. So if we go open that document up in Word, and we go to the Visual Basic editor, then we see nothing. So as far as we can tell, there are no macros in this document. So we might feel comfortable to enable them, but as soon as we enable them, we get a message box pop up, and stuff suddenly appears in the Visual Basic editor. So this can be pretty tricky. I know personally when I get a macro-enabled document that for some reason I need to enable the macros, I always switch over and look, does it seem reasonable for me to enable these macros? What kind of bad tricks are my teammates playing on me? And so you switch over there and you're like, oh, it's just gonna do this one thing, or there's nothing here, that's odd. And you go ahead and enable macros, and then it can do anything it wants, different from your impression of what it was gonna do. And as Harold mentioned, most AV scanners are looking at the compressed VBA source, because I mean you can see from that slide that it's much easier to understand the VBA source than the P code. So that's the easy way to write signatures. So this can bypass a lot of AV. This idea is not new. Dr. Bonchev gave code and also proof of concepts for the earlier versions of Office for VBA stomping, although he didn't refer to it as VBA stomping, so you can review that work there. We mentioned that the P code would only run if it's compatible, so the VBA version that the creator uses to create the document needs to match the VBA version of the victim, and that's pretty tightly coupled to the Office version. So if the attacker can determine the Office version of their victim, they can build this payload just to run on their system or that version of Office. So how we can deal with this as an attacker is we can analyze the user agent string that we get. The user agent string is a bit of text that's sent automatically by email clients and web browsers when information is fetched from the web. So if we look up information, if we look up user agent strings, we can determine things like Office version and Windows version, which helps us target that victim specifically with the P code. So for example, I can send an email to my victim with a link to an image, and when their email client goes to fetch that image so they can display it to the user, that image is on my server, and when it fetches it, it'll include the user agent. So now, without the victim really doing anything except receiving an email, I have their user agent string, which I can analyze, figure out what VBA or Office version they're using, and then build my payload specifically for that victim. One thing that can be done for anti-analysis is to include an application.quit at the end of the macro. So down here, we see that we have a VBA stomp document. There, it looks like there's no macros, but there is in the P code. At the end of this macro is a call to application.quit, like shown on the left. So you can imagine the attacker doing something nefarious and then calling application.quit. So that as soon as this runs, we know that the true source is going to pop up in this VBA editor. But if the analyst doesn't have a chance to look at it before the application quits, it's going to be difficult to figure out what this malicious document does. So here we're going to enable content, and then before we can see anything in the VBA editor or analyze it, it's quit. So that's a bummer because we really don't want to look at the P code because that's difficult. We know that Word knows how to decompile that P code, and we want it to, but as soon as it does, it exits Word and we don't get to see it. So we did come up with a way to deal with this problem so that we could analyze documents, at least for Microsoft Word. And so we've got this same document over here on the right. We found that if you delete the VBA data.xml file, it'll stop any macros from automatically executing. So this is exactly what we want. So we're going to open this document with 7-zip again and go into the Word directory and just delete VBA data.xml. It's not the VBA project.bin file that contains what we've talked about previously, but it's a XML file describing the macros. We're going to delete that and go ahead and save that. Okay, so now we're going to open that document. That's the same document as before, but we've deleted the VBA data.xml file. So we see no macros because it's been VBA stomped. Last time we enabled content, everything went away. We didn't get to see the code. But this time when we enable content, it pops up and we see what would happen, should have happened, could have happened, but didn't. So now, presumably there's a bunch of nefarious code there that we can analyze and the application doesn't quit. So this is a trick to get Word to decompile that P code for us, let us look at it without executing it and then exiting before we can look at it. And this works to disable all auto execution type routines. So it's typical to use auto open because that's designed to run as soon as a document's open and macros are enabled. But there's other tricky ways to get macros to run, such as when an image loads, run this macro, which an image always loads when you open the document. Or like when a toolbar menu is added to the toolbar. I added a link, a Black Hills post there, how to fish with PowerPoint, because PowerPoint doesn't have any sort of auto-open kind of method. So if you want to fish with PowerPoint, you need another way to get it to auto-execute. So there's a technique there that will do that. This will also disable those type of techniques. So I'll turn the time over to Kirk, and he's going to give us some real-world VBA stomping examples.
All right, so we've been looking a lot at like the general ideas on how this works, what you need to do to confuse AV, confuse analysts, and things like that. And so for those like teaching purposes, we've gone through like some small examples with message boxes and things like that. But now we're going to take a look at how does this work if you use it with like a real world, like legitimate maldoc. So the maldoc that we picked for this example is an Emotet maldoc from the wild, from the actual Emotet campaign. We specifically picked one that is fairly old. So this is something from back in June. And so this is old enough that a lot of kind of like the trailing edge AV companies have put some sort of detection in for it. So for this particular doc, it has a pretty high detection rate. It's up at 39 out of 60 detections. So to test out what sort of effect doing VBA stomping on something like this that has a very high detection rate is, we wrote a small script that would automatically do the VBA stomping on like any sort of document that we give it. So for our script, it goes and just wipes out the compressed VBA source code with a series of randomly chosen bytes. So we just ran this tool document through our tool, so like a little run a single script. And what happened was we went from 39 out of 60 detections down to 9 out of 59 detections. So this is a document that had a very, very high detection rate. With very little effort on our part, we were able to take that document and drop off 30 of the AV companies from detecting that document. So that indicated to us, since I'm on the blue team, that this is something that we need to take a look at. How do we, like if this starts getting used on campaigns out there, what are we going to do about this? So to show you an example of like what sort of problems this causes for a defender, we went and took our stomped Emotet document and ran it through like a lot of the tools that we use as analysts to try to work with malicious documents. So one of the main tools, big tools that we use when we're analyzing these documents is an open source tool called Ole VBA. This is a tool developed by Philippe Lacage. And basically what it does is it decompresses the VBA source code for you, shows it on the screen to you so you can work with it, and uses some heuristics to tell you if there's like suspicious things that you should look at inside this code. We can see that whenever we run Ole VBA on our stomped Emotet document, first it crashes with a exception and then just gives us like no useful output at all. Same thing with like a tool called Ole Dump that's written by DDA Stevens. Ole Dump allows you to work with Ole files. It's more for kind of like getting in with a lot more detail on what's going on in the different Ole streams and things like that. So Ole Dump doesn't crash, but whenever we dump the compressed, what should be the compressed VBA out of that stream, all we get are a bunch of garbage characters because we just overwrote them with random bytes. There's nothing there that we can work with. And, another tool that we use heavily every single day at Walmart is a tool called ViperMonkey. And ViperMonkey is a VBA macro emulator that actually uses emulation to tell you what a VBA macro would do. So this is, again, a tool that was originally written by Philippe Lacage. Since he wrote the original version, we've kind of taken over the maintenance and extension of that at Walmart. We put this through ViperMonkey, and again, we just see garbage. We're getting no useful information out of this at all. So far, none of the tools that we use for trying to work with malicious documents, none of them are giving us anything useful at all. So let's see, where did that go? Okay, and then final tool that you can use for looking at the Ole VB, looking at the VBA source code is the SigTool utility that comes with ClamAV. It has an option for dumping out compressed VBA source code, and SigTool handles this the most gracefully of all the tools, which is there's no compressed VBA source code there that I can work with, so it does nothing at all. So what can we do about this? So all of these tools that I've shown there before are all concentrating and working with the VBA source code inside the document. That's nice to work with because it's readable, it's understandable, it has lots of strings and recognizable functions in it that make it really easy to key off of as a defender. What is not changed whenever you do the VBA stomping is the compiled P code that's in the document. So Dr. Bonshev on his GitHub there has a tool called P-code dump, which is a P-code disassembler. And so we're able to take a look at here. This is a snippet of P-code from the stomped Emotet doc. And we can see that the P-code from the original document is on the one side. The P-code from the stomp document is on the other side. And they are byte for byte exactly the same. So the stomping does not, by design, does not affect the P-code at all. So that kind of tells us where we need to go as defenders for how to deal with this if this is used against us offensively. So like Carrie and Harold pointed out, a lot of like the signature-based detections out there are specifically targeting the VBA source code that's in there. If you also include signatures that are based on the P code rather than on the VBA source code, you're then going to be able to detect these and not get fooled whether or not there's VBA stomping going on or at all. Then here's like the obvious one for dealing with VBA stomping is if it has not been stomped, the VBA source code in there should match up with the P code. And if they don't, that throws up a big red flag. And then finally, the end goal of the attacker is to actually have something happen to accomplish their purposes. So the document is going to need to actually be able to execute and run. So you can just run this in a sandbox and check for the same sort of malicious behavior that you'd be looking for, whether it was stomped or not stomped. Now, one caveat with the sandboxing is that if it was VBA stomped, the document is only going to execute and work in the environment that has the correct VBA version. So if your sandboxing solution does not open these up and sandbox them using multiple Office and Windows versions, there's a potential that you will miss the malicious behavior from a VBA stomp document. So what do these defenses look like if you implement them? So what we have up here is an example of a signature that's written based on the P code rather than the VBA source code. So this is a Yara signature. There are like a few AV tools out there that allow you to include custom Yara signatures. And so what we have up here is a signature that is looking for lots and lots of calls to the VBA mid function, so pulling out like a chunk out of a string. So mid is used by a lot of in-the-wild Maldoc campaigns for decoding their payload. Typically, you don't expect to see like 75, 100, 200 calls to mid in like a regular business process document. So seeing lots of calls to mid is kind of like throws up a flag as a defender when you see that in your environment. So if you ever done any work with like developing signatures for like PE executables or like executable files in general, like the sort of thought process that you use for writing those sort of signatures, it's very similar to the thought process you use for these P code signatures. P code is basically like a virtual machine instruction set, and so you're going to be writing signatures that recognize the binary bytes and things like that in the compiled P code. So we see down here inside the comment, whenever we're writing these signatures, we rely heavily on Dr. Bonshev's P code dump tool for disassembling the P code. So in his disassembler, it provides both the readable disassembly output plus the raw bytes that correspond to the disassembly lines. And so we use that to look through there, look for what are the different ways that you can call mid, how are those represented in the P code instructions. Then we write our nice and so easy to read regular expression down there for picking out the bytes. And then in Yara, we say that if we see more than 75 of those instructions in the P code, we're going to throw up a red flag and take a closer look, do something with this document. Now, we've also done some work in the area of looking for VBA source code, P code mismatches, because this is where the kind of like more obvious avenue to take with this is. So we've written an open source tool called VBA Seismograph, which is written in Python. It's up on GitHub. It has a MIT license. So basically, if y'all are interested in this, and especially if you have security products, please steal it and try to use it. So what the VBA Seismograph does is just looks through the P code, pulls out all of the defined functions, function names, variable names out of the P code, and checks, do these show up in the VBA source code? It looks for all of the string literals that are defined in the P code. Do those show up in the VBA source code? Looks at, interestingly enough, in the P code, it actually includes the comment lines that should show up in the VBA, so we check for those also. And if we see anything that are showing up inside the P code that do not show up inside the VBA source code, VBA Seismograph will throw up a flag and say this is something you need to take a closer look at. So that concludes the content of the talk. We have a website up, that https://vbastomp.com, that has links to some blog posts that we wrote that go into more detail about what we covered in the talk. Also, like links to the VBA Seismograph GitHub, links to Dr. Bonchev's work, and other things like that. So at this point, we can open it up for questions. Yeah, so we started to do like a, okay, so the question was, okay, so we've been looking at different like obfuscations and modifications to that compressed VBA source code. And the question was, how about going from the other end? So you work with and mess up the P code rather than doing things with the VBA source code. So kind of going the opposite direction from like Carrie's example where she modified the VBA source code in there, you ran it, did something different. How about doing that from the other end where you modify the P code and now it doesn't match the VBA source code? So we did like a little bit of work with that. Since the P code's like a compiled instructions and stuff like that, it's a little bit less forgiving of like fiddling around with the values in there. So it's definitely possible to do it. It would take a little bit more effort than we had like time allocated to do it. So yeah. What kind of prevalence are you seeing in the wild? Oh yeah, that was really interesting. So the question is, what sort of prevalence in the wild are we seeing where the P code doesn't match the disassembled VBA source code? So we pull down like a bunch of maldocs every day from VirusTotal and run them through different analyzers to see what's going on with different campaigns and stuff like that. So we added the VBA Seismograph into that process, and we were expecting to see like really basically none, but we're not seeing none. We're probably seeing about 4 to 5 docs a day where there are obviously functions that are in the P code that are not appearing in the VBA source code. From doing manual analysis on there, it doesn't look like the functions are like called or like really doing anything. But the fact that there's a difference there, like we think that might be like an artifact of the malware, of the maldoc builder that the people are using. But at this point, like we haven't dug into enough to figure out like how they're getting that to happen, because they're not just stomping over like all of the VBA source code, like the way we've been showing in this talk. They have valid VBA source code there. They have valid P code, but the two of them don't match. Right? Uh-huh.
What malware family are you seeing that you are seeing a lot? Is it specific, like, grouping that you're seeing, or is it kind of scattered?
It's, okay, so, like there's like a kind of low-level Retefe Maldoc campaign that's going on, and like periodically, like whenever they'll have a Maldoc template that will have this mismatch between the VBA source and the P code. We've seen some like other small campaigns that we have not been able to track down like what exactly the campaign it is. So they tend to be like much smaller campaigns that are doing this, like the big ones like Ursnif and Emotet and stuff like that. Those all, the P code matches up exactly with the VBA. So the question is, like, do we think that these may be the cases where things look like there's a mismatch, whether it looks like it may be a targeted attack or not? For the majority of them that I'm seeing, I don't think it's a targeted attack because we'll see like maybe like 5, 6, 10 docs where they've like changed up like the document content, like what you would see when you bring it up in Word. But the P code and the VBA is exactly the same in it, so it looks like it's probably an artifact of whatever Maldoc builder they're using. But we are seeing some where we have like one doc that we're not seeing anything like that showing up at all, so that potentially could be like a targeted attack. Okay, so the question is whether it is possible to get like multiple versions of the P code in there that are targeted towards different versions of VBA. From what I've seen of the P code, like I think there's like information like up at the top that we've seen that kind of says something about like the VBA DLL and stuff like that it's expecting to get. So
there are some hard-coded paths like in the actual OLE object that point to like the DLL path that it expects for the VBA, and we think that we're still trying to pin down like the exact combination of information that like of OS and Office version and the VBA version that's installed on the system that controls whether or not the P code will execute or it falls back to the VBA source. But we are, at this point, our running theory is that if those paths don't exist in the VBA version and the DLLs aren't there, then it's not going to run. So trying to create multiple P code that would run on multiple versions, we haven't like debugged Word to see like where it's looking and what it's doing to see if we could trick it into doing multiple. So we're not 100%, but at this point, those paths lead us to believe that you'd have to have a specific P code. Have time for probably one more question? Buddy?
I think we're done.
Good, cool. Thank you very much.
Okay,
So, there's a handheld, so we can just pass a handheld, so if you wanna.
And that's for the projector, it's over there.
Yeah, well, there's a hookup over here, I think. I believe there's a hookup up here. Where's HDMI? You see HDMI?
Got a flashlight.
Yeah, I got. I'm using. I'm gonna have to do the same thing. That's the microphone. Where is the HDMI cable to plug into?
I think it's hanging off on the left.
Hanging off on the left.
At least that's where it was when I was working yesterday.
It's going to the microphone.
Okay.
See.
Did
Here we go. Here we go. Got it.
they
Stuck
stuck
in the hole. Okay, there we go. Okay, cool. Alrighty. Let me plug in and power up. Remind me to leave with everything I have here. Take a nap.
I'll start distributing these parties. Sorry.
What now? Oh, that's a problem. Here, hang on. My mouse went all the way over there. Okay. I guess it's a question of how many people are still hungover from last night. All of us. All of us? You'll get carded.
Yeah, that's something I'm used to.
All right, so,
Did you get one?
So what, so Steve?
Yes.
We have a handheld to pass between whoever's not the, but, I don't know if you want to move the chair up here or. So I don't know how we want to, I don't know how we arrange this as far as,
Well, see, the cool part is because we can see our slides, we'll just pass it around and come up to the thing.
okay, all right, cool. Mic time. This is our, so we got a mic here and a mic there and we can do the hands off.
No, this.
No, it should be fine.
Yeah.
It's a baton. It's easier, it's the easiest way for us to tell somebody it's their turn to talk.
Yeah, like literally, if he smacks me in the head with the mic, I'll know it's my turn to say stuff. Otherwise, I'll just stand here and be like, hi. Hold it up like this. Do we get our notes?
Yeah, the notes are in here.
Sweet.
This is why despite the fact that the fonts all break, I'm very happy with LibreOffice to present stuff, so
Is this one and that one live?
this is also live, yes.
Oh, well then, I mean,
Whatever you want to do, we can do tag team and just,
yeah, we could just do tag team because if you
and
come
we're
too
gonna
close
hold,
with
and
that,
what,
we're gonna.
but the thing is then we can step off to the side, or I mean, because if we're gonna also be commenting on.
Back the chairs up and do the kind of little shuffle dance.
We could. This is fun.
So we,
I just want to say I'm impressed to see all of you up this early in the morning. That is awesome. I know it wasn't. I'm standing on stage and I'm still wondering why I'm up this early. It's okay. Don't feel bad.
Yeah, but how many people actually went to the party last night and how many didn't? I didn't go. And you showed up, so.
yeah, I actually did go to the party briefly. I got my 15 minutes of Vanilla Ice and that was enough for me, thank you.
Word to your mother.
That's right. Well, he led with that. He led with Ice Ice Baby, so it was pretty much.
After that,
It was after that he was doing other people's stuff. So. Really? Yeah.
Anyway, here's Wonderwall.
really?
Pretty well, not bad,
I'd love
but
to see that.
yeah. We have a lighting issue.
Paul, bottom switch there turns it on or off.
Okay.
So I'm leaving it off. And then,
Good, then we can go.
then we pass it. Yeah, just if you look down at it and you don't see that red
Okay.
light, it's off.
Well, do you want to just take turns with this thing, or you want to hand it back?
No, we could take turns with this thing, but if it comes to a point where we need the mic, we're
Yeah.
gonna flip it off.
All right. Wasn't Vanilla Ice like flipping houses on TV for a while?
He still
Yes,
flips out.
and, he's got the, and
He's
he
got a
and he
great
did a
side
sh-
hustle
he did a
flipping out.
he did a shout out to his project, the Vanilla Ice project, season 6 starting now.
Yeah. Derby Con, who needs a house? Come to Florida.
I think it's on VH1 if I'm not.
Look at those wall sconces framing the doors. That's kind of amazing. Do they
You
sort of-
notice the most obscure things about a room.
Because they look weird. Look at them. They're like alien blobs.
Hey, they were the
Do you
height of.
remember what you said in DC when you were noticing the room we were in before we got up on stage?
No idea.
I can't believe this backstage has such dark curtains. Look how you can't see anything back here. And then we walked out on stage. Yes, you were noticing the most obscure things about the room.
Well, you know, that's what you get when you have Asperger's syndrome.
Okay, we.
All right, sounds like it's ready to start.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning. Welcome to Hacking the News. This is an InfoSec guide to the media and how to talk to them, or alternatively, how not to talk to them, and how to run away from them. We three are all journalists. I'm Sean Gallagher. I'm the IT and National Security Editor at Ars Technica.
I'm Steve Reagan, Senior Staff Writer at CSO Online. I'm also manager of Salted Hatch.
And I'm Paul Wagensoo. I'm the Senior Security Editor, or Senior Editor of Common Security at Tom's Guide and Laptop Magazine.
So we're going to explain some things about the media, what exactly we mean by media and what the definition of media actually is, how you get your message out through the media if you are a researcher or doing other things in the field and you want to get attention, and other tips and tricks on interacting with the media. We heard you like examples, so we've added some examples in our examples. The key thing to remember as we're talking is that media is a lot like InfoSec in that there's people with varying levels of skill and varying types of motivations. There are bad journalists, there are good journalists, and you need to be able to understand the skill set and the motivations of the people you're talking to when you talk to them or before you talk to them, so that you get your message across in the right way and you don't end up being used for something rather unfortunate.
Anyway, we're going to take questions at the end of this. I'm sure there will be plenty of them. We will also be here all during the conference. Just feel free to corner us. We gave an earlier version of this presentation at ShmooCon this year. And if you want to see that video, it's up on YouTube and the Internet Archive. And we also gave it at B-Side Las Vegas, where like three people showed up, but that may be online as well.
But this one is much more fresh.
Yeah, fresh. Depth.
So what's the media? Technically speaking, the media is any vehicle for delivering information, and the most common types are print and broadcast. That's what we define them as. A print is anything where letters are put on a page or a screen, and broadcast is voice, images, over the wire, over the airwaves. Reporters and journalists are the people who push information into those media forms. So media also includes, when we talk about print, for example, we're talking about also blogs and, to some degree, Twitter, because Twitter has become a media platform. If you all have blogs, you are essentially already the media. You may not be a journalist on a daily basis, but you are actually producing content that could be considered media. And social media is also media, because the trust that people put in people who they believe to be experts in the field, it makes them, in a way, journalists. And there's some side effects to that. Okay, so broadcast media. When you turn on the TV in the morning or you listen to the radio, that's broadcast media, or it could be a podcast, or it could be a YouTube channel. But for what we're speaking about, we're talking about corporate media in general. So with broadcast media, generally speaking, news is produced by a producer and not by the person who is reading the news on the broadcast. So when you see a reporter on the TV news, generally they have a producer who's put the story together for them, and they are just reading the script they got. In some cases, they're actually doing some journalism, but it's more common that they are just reading content they got that they were prepped for by their producer. Depending upon whether it's cable or local news and things like that, there's going to be limited slots to fill in these things, and so you're not going to get a lot of time with a particular story. The entire topic needs to be summed up in about 10 seconds when you're pitching these people, because really, they only have about 2 minutes to present a story. Pardon me. So the problem also here is that very few producers in television or radio have any specific experience with any given field. There's no sort of beats for these people. So if you come to somebody with a security story in a broadcast medium, they're not necessarily going to have the expertise to really tell the story with any sort of nuance. So forget nuance when you have 2 minutes to do it in, and also expect that because of the way broadcast media works, if it bleeds, it leads. They'll be looking for the most controversial piece of a story in order for it to go forward. So I've had plenty of times when I've had a broadcast journalist come to me and ask me about a story and asked me for the controversy, and I've downplayed the controversy and the story hasn't aired. So they're more interested in things that are going to have a direct impact on their viewership and get people to hang on to watch the story through a couple of ads. So that's the problem with dealing with broadcast media, is that you have, again, limited time, limited amount of experience with the topic, and a need for controversy to drive story forward. With print, it follows a news cycle similar to what you see on TV now in terms of it's constantly going forward because of the web. So things have changed a lot in print. And when we talk about print, we're talking about magazines, newspapers, and websites. Most newspapers now have websites. Things have changed with the news cycle. It used to be that when something happened, it broke in print first, and then broadcast stole it and ran with the story again. Now it breaks on Twitter, it breaks on print, it breaks on broadcast, it breaks on print again, it goes back to Twitter, it echoes around. Again, most print journalists are generalists, but they tend to have more of a beat focus than people in broadcast. So especially people like us who specialize in security, we may not have any particular deep expertise in any particular part of security, but we cover the industry in general, we cover the topics in general, so we have more experience in dealing with this sort of topic than somebody who may be the general tech reporter at the New York Times or at another outlet. Again, if it bleeds, it leads. Most print publications are looking for some sort of controversy to get you to click. And if it's not going to have something that grabs the particular readership of that print media, it won't show up. Or it will, but it'll be buried deep in the newspaper, or it'll be deeper and deeper into the site. And another thing to think about when you're approaching different types of media, look at the publications and how they're structured, how the staff is structured. Some print journalists have a lot more freedom about what types of stories they can go after. For example, I don't have anybody tell me what I have to write. I go out and I pick the stories myself, I write them, and pretty much once I've written them, they go online. Other people may have to have, may get assignments from an editor, or they may have to clear a story with an editor before they can go forward with it. It may go through multiple levels of editorial approval before they can do it, and so they have less freedom about how they go after stories.
How many of you, show of hands, have pitched a story to the media before? Handful of you in the room, for those of you watching on the video stream. So when you pitch to the media, there are a couple things a reporter has to do. And we're going to talk about something called the smell test. And the joke I had prepared for this was, you know, it's 5 things, and number 4 is going to shock you. So when you're pitching to the media, you have to understand who the reporter is, what their publication is, and what they're doing. And the easiest way you can do that is by reading. Simply know who you're reading and who you want to talk to, and try to think about where your story fits into their ultimate goals or existence. So, for example, you know that he does national security. Sean does. So if you had something related to national security, you're more likely to want to talk to him than you would me, because unless you understand what I'm writing, you would know that I would only cover national security if I could look at it as a broader concept, not just how it's going to affect the government, but how it's going to affect my mom and dad and other people in the public. So there are differences between us, even though we may both cover security. So the smell test that you see there is just a quick breakdown of how we go about checking a story. And it's not a new concept. You know, those who've been in the media for a while are kind of used to this roll through here, but it starts with the source. And what I mean by that is, who are you? Who are you? Why are you talking to me right now? What are you trying to convey, and how connected to this story are you? And then immediately following that, I've got to question your motivation. What is it you're getting out of this? Why are you talking to me?
is there something of a benefit to you in having this story come out? 9 times out of 10, when a pitch comes across my email and the person on the other end wants me to tell their story, their motivation is to promote their product or their company. This is not a huge national interest story or a public interest story. It's simply somebody trying to sell something. So the motivation right there is where I start filtering out news pitches every day. To give you an example, last week before I got here, I received just over 1,000 pitches in my email. Those of you who follow me on a regular basis know I wrote one story last week. It was a breaking news story about a data breach at a hospital in Georgia. I was not pitched that story. That story did not come to me via email. So out of those 1,000 emails I got, 0 of them became stories. I got my story last week because a source called me that I know, they are reliable, and they said, something strange happened. That's where that story came from. It didn't come from a pitch. So the evidence is actually what a lot of you understand the media to do. You know that when a story comes out, we have to prove what we're telling you. So is there evidence supporting the claims of the story? Well, when you're pitching things to us, the first thing we're going to do is look at the evidence. Does it support what you're saying? And then, of course, logic. So you've came to me with a pitch. You have some evidence. The evidence seems to support it, but does it logically support it? Probably. But if it doesn't, then we have to fix that. I have to go through and question why that is. And then the last one you see there is left out. This is critical. What is left out that's going to change the narrative of my story? So I've got your pitch, I've got your evidence, but what are we missing? What conclusively finishes off this story, or more importantly, what's left out that might change where we're going? We'll talk about some examples of how left out plays into things a little bit later. But it's really key that reporters ask this question and that you consider it when you're pitching. And the reason why is because left out isn't just a thing. Sometimes left out is a who. Is there a group of people being left out of this story? Is there a person that's greatly involved that's not being included to where their insight might dramatically change how this story appears? Things like this are how we go about running through. Go ahead.
So I was just going to add that the left out part also is important. If you're pitching a story, you're pitching something about a story that is already broken. I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten emails from people saying, hey, we saw you wrote this story about this breach. Our CSO would like to tell you his opinion about this breach.
Yeah.
Or our president would like to tell you how our product would have prevented this breach from happening. I don't care, okay? I want to have some more information that extends the story rather than having commentary on the story. So if you have something that's left out about the story, if you have something that is a factor that hasn't been taken into account by other people who've already reported the story or commented on the story, that's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear your opinion on what happened and on the facts I've already presented. I want to hear more detail that helps expand the understanding of the story, helps people take action about the problem at the root of the story, and things like that. So that last part, left out, is critical if you're coming to me with a follow-on to an existing story.
And to relate that to this existing crowd, a lot of you are extremely intelligent in given areas of security. So when you see a story that's right up your alley, something you've covered or researched, immediately you want to jump on that and you want to talk and share your experiences and your knowledge. The easiest way to do that is to look at what's left out. You're experts in that field. So to give you an example, earlier this year I wrote a story about something and a researcher reached out to me and was like, I saw you wrote about this, but why didn't you mention X? And I said, well, what's X? And they're like, how are you covering this story if you don't know about X? Now, that may come off as harsh, but they had a valid point because X was not included in the narrative, and because this particular topic is not something everybody's familiar with, of course, unless you're deep into that topic, X is not something you looked at. So I got an education and a follow-up story because somebody reached out with what was left out and said, what about X?
So sometimes the reverse is true. Sometimes you will be cold called or cold emailed by a reporter. And you may wonder, why is this reporter coming to you? Generally, it's because the reporter's heard of you. You may have commented on a previous story at some other publication, and the reporter just picked that up and got your email address. Or you may have had a correspondence with this reporter before, in which case you're a guaranteed source. Often, frankly, when I have a story, I just email, cold call, probably a dozen people and see who responds. And if you respond, then I'm going to try to use you again. Often reporters will also want somebody, I mean, I don't do this, I want facts, but a lot of reporters want controversy, so they'll call somebody or email somebody who is known to give a controversial opinion, a contrarian opinion, something inflammatory, something.
Or they'll just take something that you posted on Twitter.
Yeah, that too. Anyway, everyone wants a good quotation, and I mean a good quotation, not a good paraphrase. They don't want to take what you said and rewrite it because you can make a mistake that way. But generally, when a reporter calls you, he wants your opinion, your source, your take, and he wants a nice, good quotation. So, but before you respond, especially if you work for a big, security company, you may want to talk to your PR people. I mean, you really should, because you should not be commenting to the press without your company's PR being involved.
Real quick, how many of you in here work for a company with a known communications department or PR agency representing it? All right, I want all of you with your hands up. Keep them up there real quick, and I want everybody else in the room to look. These are the ones who have supposedly had media training and everything like this. So if you've got your hands up right now, because you know that, put your hands down if you have not had media training. Who's got media training under their belt? Notice how quickly those numbers dropped.
Yeah.
That's a bad thing.
Right.
And it's not your fault, mind you. It's not. But that is exactly what we're talking about here. You should never talk to the media if you've got a comms department or a PR department, because that's their job, not yours. But sometimes you're going to be picked to be a representative, and if you're not adequately prepared, well. Paul, you want me to move on? Paul, move on? Are you?
I'm done.
You were, but I didn't know if you went ahead.
Oh, no, I mean, well, basically, back to the earlier point about dealing with media, one thing you got to remember is we are not your PR department. We don't do advertising for you. We don't want to really care. We don't care if your company suddenly made a lot of money or got acquired or has a new CSO. We want interesting stuff that's relevant to the general public. Some PR departments really don't take that to heart. They should. That's why we delete their emails.
So the worst in journalism is like the worst in InfoSec. And what we mean by that is you've got good reporters, bad reporters, and everybody in between, just like we do in the InfoSec community. That will shock none of you.
There are journalistic script kiddies.
Yes, very much so. And the thing is, a journalist will be able to spot a journalistic script kiddie really quickly, because we too got that same press release. So when I watch you cut and paste it and then publish it as an original story, you're a kiddie. So now we're going to get to the tips and tricks portion. And honestly, if you remember anything from this talk, this next slide is the only thing I want you to remember, okay? Get your cameras out. Because right now I'm going to talk to you about the difference between on the record, off the record, and on background, okay? These are three terms that every journalist knows, but sometimes the public doesn't understand. Now, those of you who were in here when we first arrived, we handed out some cards, and if you did not get one of those cards, see us after this talk and we'll make sure you get one, because those cards describe this slide perfectly. And for those of you watching on camera or maybe watching this later, ask us and we'll give you some, because we have hundreds of them and we'll be passing them out all weekend long. So yeah, from a t-shirt cannon. We're not responsible for paper cuts. So let's start with the top, on the record, okay? That means exactly what you think it is. And the easiest way to remember on the record is a very simple catchphrase. Everything you say can and will be used in the story. So if you are on the record, you need to imagine everything you've said as a headline. So when you look at the front page of the New York Times and you said that Apple was boo-boo, well, guess what? You just said Apple was boo-boo, and that's the headline. Everything you say will be used, okay? Now, on background means that I can use what you've told me, but I can't say that you said it.
On background is the most common conversation a journalist will have. In fact, 9 times out of 10, if I'm talking with someone at a conference, it is on background. But just because you have an on-background conversation with somebody does not mean they are bound to stick to it. And so the same is with off the record, which we'll get to in a minute, okay? So when you're having an on-background conversation, typically you'll see that translated in the news as sources familiar with, senior administration officials have said. These are all on-background conversations, which means the reporter is free to use what they've said, they just can't attribute it to anyone. And now we're going to get to the big one. This is what trips up most people, because they assume that saying something is off the record is like this powerful shield. And I can promise you it is not. In fact, how many of you would love to have an off-record conversation with one of us right now about something? Let's just say you in the front row, I could see you, so I'm going to pick on you. Let's say you come up to me and you say, hey, Steve, off the record, so-and-so just did this. Well, guess what? We're not off the record. But do you know why? Because I did not agree to being off the record. When you go off the record with a reporter, that is a very powerful type of connection between the two of you. And unless the reporter agrees, you are not off the record.
It's a two-way handshake.
It has to be that way. It has to be a two-way handshake. For those of you that didn't hear it, that's a really great analogy. I like that. I'm stealing it. You're never getting it back. It has to be two ways, though. If the reporter does not agree, you are not off the record. But let's say the reporter does agree. So I agree we're off the record, you asked for off the record, now we're having an off the record conversation. What you need to be aware of is I'm going to take everything you said, and without naming you, without attributing it to you, I'm going to try and find an on the record source. That's my job. It's not because I'm trying to be mean to you, it's because that's my job. I have to try and find on the record sources. My boss is never going to let me talk about something that was written off the record. I can't run a story with 9 off-the-record sources say so-and-so. I can't. I have to find someone on the record. So the easiest way to do that is to go to someone and say, hey, I'm hearing rumors that blah, blah happened to X. What do you know about that? Well, the thing is, blah, blah is the off-the-record conversation, and X is the subject of said off-the-record conversation. I just never named who my sources were. It's very common, but that's something that happens. You have to be prepared for it. Go ahead.
I was just going to add that if you have an off-the-record conversation with one journalist, if another journalist in the room does not have that relationship with you, it's not off the record to them, as President Trump found out with the Toronto Star.
Yes. Anybody remember that story? Toronto Star and the one of the American newspapers, Trump.
This was Bloomberg.
Bloomberg, yeah.
So President Trump was having an interview with Bloomberg, and he said, this is off the record, and Bloomberg agreed, but the Toronto Star got a hold of the conversation and did not agree in advance to that, so they ran him saying, we're never going to make an agreement with Canada. And so that caused some problems for him. Also, everything you do in email, it goes by the same rules. You have to make sure that you have an agreement beforehand that if you're having a conversation off the record in email, that it's off the record.
We'll show you an example of that here in a minute. That's a big one. So, moving forward, when we're going back and forth with some other pitching tips and tricks, I want you to think of those 3 points we just raised and then check yourself off here. So, once you've established how the conversation goes, and these are rules you set up before the conversation starts. So before you say anything to a journalist, find out if you're on the record, off the record, or on background. But I want you to always assume you are on the record. Always. You should always assume you are on the record. I'm going to say that again. Assume you are on the record. And the reason for that is you only go off record with a reporter if you have a really good relationship with them, meaning you've known them forever. You trust them. How many of you can immediately say, and don't feel bad if it's absolutely none of you, you would implicitly trust the 3 of us to go off the record? Exactly.
Nobody? Really?
And the thing is, I don't blame a single one of you, because unless we've earned that trust, there's no reason for you to ever be off the record with us. None. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Our jobs are built around everybody not fighting us one way or another. That's how we do it. So when you're looking at pitching and you're trying to reach out to a reporter and you have this idea of what the conversation is going to be like, some easy things to get the process moving is don't pitch products or services. You heard Sean talk about that one. If you're going to talk to a reporter, don't pitch products or services. You heard us mention that. And of course, don't promote products or services. These are things that stand out to a reporter.
The more altruistic you come off, the more likely they are to talk to you. So, and commerce is not necessarily altruistic. So.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to move forward to an example real quick, since we just talked about it. How many of you saw this headline? A couple of you did. Okay, so what you see above that is Elon Musk's email to that reporter. Notice the first thing he wrote in that email, off the record. Now, show of hands, who believes this conversation is off the record because of that? Exactly. All of you are paying attention. Good morning. Thank you.
Just because you're a billionaire doesn't mean you can make something off the record just by saying so.
So let's look at this email. He starts off incorrectly assuming the conversation's off the record, and then in the second sentence, he calls the reporter, I'm not going to say that because, I don't want to see the YouTube video get demonetized later for language, but you could see there, he's cussing out the reporter. So does the reporter have any obligation at this point to keep this conversation off the record, or do you think the reporter's going to run a headline stating what was in that email? This is just one of the many conversations you will see in email that end up going so far south, it's maddening. But we chose this example because it's so rare that you get proof someone started the conversation demanding to be off the record without understanding what that means. And the confusing thing here is Tesla's not a small startup. They have an impressive communications and PR machine behind them, so there's no way he can say he wasn't trained on this. And if he was, I really, really want to know why he wasn't. Otherwise, there's no excuse for that. That type of email should have never have been sent because, again, if you have a communications department, should you be talking to reporters directly? No.
He probably, is the time on the email 4:20?
God, that'd have been great if it was.
Wasn't that his first time smoking pot? That one with the.
I don't know.
I
don't believe it was, because when he took the first hit on the podcast, he didn't cough. Usually the newbies choke themselves out. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, and this is an example, when you're pitching the media, don't repeat negatives. Okay. And what I mean by repeat negatives is if you hear somebody say something bad and you're trying to make a point, don't repeat it. Years and years and years ago, Yahoo, when it was a thing, they were going to buy a little website called Tumblr. And everybody on Tumblr accused Yahoo of screwing it up. You're going to buy Tumblr and you're going to screw it up. Our beloved website's going to go down the drain. And so Yahoo, trying to get ahead of that fear, they issued a statement that says, we promise we will not screw it up. That's the headline that appeared in Reuters the very next day. Yahoo buying Tumblr for $1.1 billion, vows not to screw it up. That is repeating the negative. And
they obviously already screwed it up because they spent $1.1 billion on it.
Yeah, they bought it for $1 billion, which is confusing. So here's the question. How many Tumblr users are of the opinion that Yahoo screwed it up? Probably a handful of them at least. And there's a headline confirming that, they lied about it. So now that's a double negative against Yahoo because they repeated it. And now that they can be held against them. The users have something. You promised you would never do this, but you did. And it's just going to come back. Anybody follow politics? So there was a person running for the Senate, and they repeated the negative, although they're the originator of the negative, which makes this a very interesting A very interesting example. This is Christine O'Donnell, and when she was running for office, she had given an interview on a talk show and said that she practiced witchcraft.
As a teenager.
As a teenager. Well, that story took off, and she tried to run from it by repeating no less than 6 times in the opening section of a video that I am not a witch.
So what's the headline?
The interview, when she made it, I dabbled in witchcraft. Those are her exact words. And then she does this big campaign video with, I am not a witch. I'm nothing you heard. I'm you. And she keeps going over and doing that. That is, again, repeating the negative. So do you think that this video got out ahead of that story and people stopped forgetting about the whole witchcraft thing? Absolutely not. Why would they? She said it 6 times in a video. I'm not a witch. I didn't know you were a witch, but I'm sure you're not now? Huh?
Have you, or are you now, or have you ever been a witch?
Yeah, have you now, or have you ever been? All right, so the last one is going to be Sean here, because this was one that we were requested to discuss.
Yeah, this is. So we were at DEF CON, and I was spending a lot of time in the voting village because I'd covered the voting village when it started, and was talking with Matt Blaze, and then this story appeared where someone in DEF CON Kids doing a capture the flag, an 11-year-old doing a capture the flag that had been set up to resemble the Florida elections website, was portrayed as being an 11-year-old who hacked the actual Florida website. And this happened partially because the person who was running the capture the flag may have overhyped what was going on there, just a little bit, just a little bit. So the problem with this is that when you throw something out there and you give it a little more, when you try to sex something up, like, hey, this kid just hacked the Florida website, it ends up discrediting every real story about this thing that comes along after it. So it's a little bit like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, right? So it makes it much harder for me to write a story about, hey, Georgia's certificates are all screwed up on their SSL is implemented horribly on their election sites. And Georgia didn't have the same number of votes as voters on their electronic voting machines. What's up with that? And everything else we cover about election security becomes slightly tarnished by an 11-year-old took 10 minutes to change the results of the election. Now, the fact is that kids were able to, within a few minutes, change votes on voting machines in the voting village. And that was a much more important story because, as it turns out, it takes less than 2 minutes on some voting machines to hack them and change results. And in fact, you could use a mobile phone to hack the card you use to vote to allow you to vote infinite times.
But do you see how? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
But this story is what got the most attention, and it sort of ended up being a smokescreen especially once it was debunked, for all of the other things that were going on. People didn't pay attention anymore.
I think that. Go ahead.
Is it the mistake of the child though, or the journalist?
In this case, it's both. The child was not the one who said this.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was the individual running the capture the flag.
Yep.
And it was also the journalist. In this case, it was a journalist who did not have a lot of experience covering information security.
The key piece of information that was kept out of the narrative when the story was being pitched was the fact that this 11-year-old was trained to spot SQL injection vulnerabilities and trained on how to exploit them.
It was a kid's CTF.
Yeah.
All right. So these kids have been hacking boxes and been popping shells on things for a while. All day long.
Like all day long. It was their thing. And so that narrative is actually kind of critical to the story. Now think back to the smell test, okay? What's left out? What's left out of the story? The fact that this was a kid CTF and the exact vulnerability they found was something they'd been working on all day long. That was what was left out. So that's what happens when you don't ask those questions and something's left out of a story. You get that. Now, ProPublica, when they came out and debunked the entire thing, forced I think it was Fast Company, that's the very top headline up there. That headline had to be changed, and so did the story, because it turns out, again, we're talking about pre-configured websites that were not the exact, they were just meant to look like them, and known vulnerabilities that were automatically inserted into. They were meant to be there. It's a training exercise. So we're going to cover one more example, and then we're going to open the floor to questions for you. This is important, okay? And Paul is going to be the one to explain this, since this was his idea. Go ahead.
One thing you got to remember, and this is not apparently obvious to a lot of people, is that while most newspapers, most newspapers' op-ed pages and editorial pages do have a particular slant on things, that's not supposed to affect the news coverage. And that is not always firmly true, but it generally is. For example, here's one from the Times, the resistance inside the Trump administration. The op-ed page at the Times is run separately from the rest of the paper. It's sort of firewalled off from the rest. They have different standards for evidence, and their sort of political slant is not supposed to affect what happens in the rest of the paper. The same thing happens to the Wall Street Journal, which has a very different editorial stance. It's even true at Fox News to an extent. The daytime stuff is supposed to be straight news, and then you get the opinion in the evening. There is a difference. These different publications do have a choice in what to cover and what not to cover, but once they start covering a story, it's supposed to be straight up. And that is true even at Fox News and CNN. So when you hear that such and such is a right-wing paper or a left-wing paper, that should not affect your opinion of their news coverage, because the news coverage is supposed to be good and it's supposed to follow the rules that we've said here. It's passing the smell test, examining the sources, getting down to the basics, presenting the facts. And we would like you to at least take away that we up here try to adhere to those rules as best we can. We really do. We cannot speak for all reporters, but if you would choose to speak to any of us, please be assured that we will follow those rules.
And this is, again, someplace where you have to take a look at who's writing something and what their track record is before you talk to them. So the New York Times separates its editorial, but there are lots of news outlets, lots of media that present opinion as news.
They call it blended coverage.
Right, so Sean Hannity is not a journalist.
Nope.
Okay, he's a commentator, okay?
Yeah.
Same is true for any number of people you see on MSNBC. There are also a lot of publications that are specifically aimed at taking a political slant. So whether it be Daily Caller or Talking Points Memo or the Huffington Post, perhaps, or Gizmodo, they have an agenda of their own, right? You know, whether that agenda be radical truth or something like that. They aren't necessarily following the same rules of editorial ethics that people who do hard news on a daily basis do.
Each of them are on stories that none of us would.
So there's something interesting about this particular editorial, though, that you see on your screen.
Yeah.
When you write an editorial for a paper of record like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, you have to sign your name to it. Your name has to be out there with your opinion, okay? What's significant about this particular story you see in the example is the fact it was written by an anonymous author. Now, without giving away my age, I could say that I have seen several presidents and been on this earth for quite some time, and I have never once seen an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times. That was a first for me, and it blew my mind.
It blew several people's minds.
The standard of what this person was writing about and talking, and the level of proof that they had to have given the editorial board at the New York Times to be allowed to write something anonymously is astronomically high. So that tells you a little bit about who it was and what they were doing, because the Times does know the name of the author. They're just never going to release it. And it's just amusing, because imagine how awkward it is in the Times newsroom to where this comes out and other reporters are assigned to write stories determining who the author is, but they can't talk to anybody in the newsroom to actually discover the name of the author. Imagine how what kind of work environment that created that week. It had to have been amusing, to say the least. So this is it for us. We're going to do a Q&A now. We are reporters. Feel free to ask us anything. And just before we start, I'm going to make it very clear. You are being recorded, okay? Therefore, nothing said in this room can be considered off the record. You do have a camera on you. Thank you.
And we do have 10 minutes for Q&A, so we'll start with the gentleman right here.
So I have a question. As an information security professional, when we're faced with reading stories in the news, sometimes we have to act on our managers act because take the Bloomberg Supermicro story as an example. We have no ability to validate that information. What would your
Congratulations on being the first person to bring up the story that all three of us knew was coming. You win, sir. You win.
So the question was, using the Bloomberg story about Supermicro as reference, how do you determine the quality of that reporting and when you're planning on taking action about it, or if you have to take action on it?
And that is not an easy question to answer, so I'm going to do my best. Okay, the first thing you need to do is look at your experience in the industry and what that story is talking about. So in this case, you're talking about a supply chain attack against a well-known vendor from a possible nation state, okay? So you need to take all of that information and your experience, and I want you to make a gut check right now. Do you think you're at risk of having your corporation attacked by a supply chain attack from a nation state vendor? If so, what's your risk level? How do you respond to that? Where is your company on the policy slide right now to be able to deal with something like this? That's where you take that story and how you push further. That's what you answer your boss when they're questioning you about this. Thing is, do you use Supermicro? No. So does it apply to you? Probably not. But is that something you need to consider with your vendors? Maybe. So what are we doing to protect ourselves against this? What assets are in place that can literally lower our risk?
So really, the long and the short of it is, look at your own threat model, do threat modeling against the news.
Yeah.
And then also consider the sources that were named, if there were named sources. And there were no named sources in this story. Right? There were a lot of denials about this story, right? So what was the vendor response? The vendor response was, we won't want to comment. Then you think there's probably something there. It doesn't help that in this case, there was a history of bad things happening. So I reported on a problem Apple had with Supermicro a year and a half ago. And it was in a very isolated incident in a test lab. They found a server that had bad firmware, that had malware in its firmware. And that's a totally different story than this one. But it was used as sort of support for this story. So the key is that, first of all, you should assume as an information security professional that the world is on fire all the time anyway. Right? Yeah. Prepare for the worst anyway, especially when you're talking about management modules on your servers. Make sure that your networking and stuff is shut down to not allow that kind of traffic to leave your network. Right? But also know that some of this reporting is speculative. Some of it is maybe it was a competitor of Supermicro saying, hey, I know a way to throw these people under the bus really bad. Yeah. And so you have to balance it. And you have to also balance it on whether you think a state actor would really want to have access to your baseboard management controllers. So the point is, look at your threat model. How does this story affect me? Are the sources good? If the sources are good and it affects me directly, then yes, I have to put it in my action line. If it's an indirect effect, or if it's it's just something that you should be aware of, you may want to alter how you look at your supply chain security.
But also look at the story skeptically. Sorry.
You should always look at stories skeptically. Even the best reported stories, you should look at skeptically.
Did we get your question? Is that good? If not, hit us up after this and we can keep talking about it because it's a very valid point.
Yeah, come to us after.
Yeah, we'll get into that offline. Go ahead.
So this kind of riffs off of what he was talking about. As consumers of the news, we get bombarded with tons of stuff a day. And as you said, there's good reporters, bad reporters, and everything in between. Well, I'm not part of that tribe, so I don't know who is who and what organization is good or bad. How is us as consumers able to
You read. You read.
Yeah.
You read and you take your experience. So let's say your background's in just straight network engineering, and I'm a reporter who writes about network gear all the time, but every story you read of mine is wrong. And you know it's wrong because you work in this field. You see the same gear I'm writing about, but every time I write about it, I get it wrong. That's a journalist you're probably not going to trust.
You should also, to be quite honest, you should look at how often somebody actually quotes a real human being.
Yeah.
And how often they refer to something they got on background or to, so as a practice, for example, myself, I prefer to never use on background in a story. I never say somebody doesn't want to be named because, for whatever reasons. The New York Times does that because that's the only way they can get their stories in some cases in the political world. But if somebody's coming to me to talk to me about something that's a problem that's in the commercial world, not in the government world, I'm never going to go on background. But in any case, look at the quality of their sources. Look at how many people they've talked to in the story. If it's a single source story, it's probably got a lower level of credibility. Look at, and the other thing is to look at the outlet in general and see if there's a certain feel for what their type of content is. And looking at other sources that have reported on that and see if there's correlation. So you have to look across multiple sources of a story, multiple outlets to determine whether that story matches up with what other people are saying.
Yeah, and it's literally just read. Go ahead.
So as an exercise in smell testing, using Supermicro as a reference, what would you have done differently than Bloomberg if so?
That is a question I'll have to answer offline. I can't stand here on stage and say that. Yeah, I can't stand here on stage and say that. No, right over there in the green.
Okay.
Real quick question, verifying a journalist's credentials, if your company doesn't have a PR department, somebody approaches you to do a story, what's the best way?
The question was, if your company doesn't have a PR or communications department, how do you verify a journalist's credentials? And it's really simple. A journalist, by ethics, is bound to tell you, I am a journalist for so-and-so, which means you get to call so-and-so and say, hey, does Steve Reagan work for you? And guarantee you they will. Now, if they're a freelance or a stringer journalist, they usually have a business card, and you are able to easily look up their work. You could Google them. You could look at other articles they've written. You could check out their social media profiles. You could do your diligence on a journalist and easily tell that they're a journalist, because most of us do not hide. It does me no good to hide the fact that I'm a journalist. So like if you look up, actually, if you just type my name into Google, the first thing you're going to see is a series of stories I've written. It's just the thing. Yeah, we got time for one more, and then we're going to have to.
If I have an ongoing relationship with a journalist and they approach me for a comment on a story that I can't or don't want to comment on, how do you frame that and how do you continue to have a productive relationship after that?
If you ever, so the question was, if I have a really good relationship with a journalist and they come to me for a comment on a story that I can't or do not want to comment on, how do I address that while maintaining the relationship? And the answer to that question is, if you have a good relationship with that journalist, the fact that you don't want to or can't comment on it will have no bearing on your relationship with that journalist.
We will understand.
Yeah, we do. We understand that completely, because there's going to be a time to where I'm going to ask you a question about a story or something I'm working on, and I know that you're familiar with the topic, or you may even have something worthwhile saying, but you simply can't comment. And I get it. I understand that.
We won't hold that against you.
No.
I mean, honestly, especially like on my beats, since I cover a broad number of beats, and they include defense and national security. I have relationships with people who I know that when they say they can't talk to me about something, it's not personal. Yeah. It's something where they just can't talk to me about it. They may suggest a channel to me to explore the story, and if that's something you want if that's something you want to throw to somebody to help them forward to the story, but you don't want to contribute to it or be involved in it yourself, you can say, you should probably talk to this person to get the best official on-the-record kind of comments about this. That will help forward things, but that would be what I would, otherwise don't worry about it. Just say, sorry, can't help you this time.
Exactly, no harm, no foul, it's good.
All right, DerbyCon, that's been our talk. Thank you for coming out this morning.
And we got these cards. Sign up the cards.
So, we will be able to have plenty of conversations with you offline. If you did not get one of our little cards, let me know, because we have hundreds of them, and I would very much like you to have tips and tricks.
We're here all week, try the veal.